Good morning. This play is called Mr. Gray's Gettysburg, and it's a two-act murder mystery. It's May 9th, 1950, and Mr. John Gray is 68 years old, a successful banker, and wealthy by investments with the Standard Oil Company since 1909. He had just married a young Georgia Belle in her 20s, Tiffany Hopkins, and approximately 10 months after a horrible event. And Mr. Gray wanted to make a silent motion picture of the Confederate Civil War, but he soon was murdered, and his son, Thornton L. was the one who might had murdered his father. And Thornton's a black man, and his mother was black too. When young Mr. Gray, a long time ago, made love in the hay barn. The light slowly dimmed to black on the interrogation room as Thornton continues to speak, as the lights slowly rise on the dining room of Mr. Gray's house. There is a circular wooden table with 4 chairs positioned around it in the center of the room, with a quaint fireplace and mantel, and several smaller rectangular wooden tables against the walls carrying candles, flower vases, a bottle of brandy with glasses, and picture frames. People like her deserve better, and she loved putting fresh flowers everywhere in the house in the morning. Mrs. Tiffany Gray enters the dining room, wearing a blue and white summer dress, with her hair grown atop her head, carrying a wicker basket full of fresh cut flowers. She's in her mid-20s, and is a lovely sight to see. She sets the wicker basket on a table as she hums and sings "Shine On, Harvest Moon," while separating the long stem flowers.
Shine on, harvest moon, up in the sky. I ain't had no lovin' since January, February, June, or July. Snow time, ain't no time to sit outdoors and spoon. Shine on, harvest moon, for me and my gal. Da, 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 da. Thornton, be a dear and bring me some pruning shears and a pitcher of water. These poor little old flowers are screaming for moisture, and I want them lasting through the day.
What is coming, Mrs. Tiffany? We don't want your pretty flowers drying up and blowing away. You sure know how to pick 'em, Mrs. Tiffany.
Thornton, do you realize the importance pruning is to keeping a healthy garden? You have to cut them to ensure positive growth. It's the pruning that preserves their beauty.
Yes, ma'am. You gotta know what to cut and when to cut it.
I swear, most men believe flowers grow on their own accord, especially John. But we know different, don't we?
We certainly do, but I don't want Mr. Gray hearing that.
Why do you call him that? Everybody knows he's your daddy.
I wouldn't know what else to call him.
How about John?
I couldn't do that, Mrs. Tiffany.
What's he gonna do, shoot you?
No, but he'd get mighty angry.
He's your daddy, isn't he?
Yes, but it's always been Mr. Gray, and I don't figure changing it now.
Suit you. It seems plain crazy to me.
Some things just don't need fixing, I guess.
Has he ever talked about your mama?
No, ma'am.
If he were my daddy, I'd want to know.
My Tabby told me all I need to know about her. Mr. Gray does things the way he sees fit. It ain't my business changing it, no none.
Well, why have you stayed with him all these years? You're a free man, aren't you?
Yes, ma'am.
But not while you're under his roof, you're not.
He's never kept me from leaving.
Why do you stay then?
When I was 8 or 9, I was helping my Tabby in the kitchen. It was early morning and we were the only two up. She had me peeling taters for breakfast. I'd like peeling taters because I crave funny faces on them. She didn't like that because it slowed off progress. I loved being with her. She told me how Mr. Gray helped her like no other person ever did. She was his nanny from the time he was born. But there came a time when he was around 8 years old when his daddy thought it best in selling her to a young sharecropping family hurting for labors. The deal was nearly done when out of the clouds comes little John Gray screaming and hollering how he didn't want his Tabby going elsewhere. Yes, he threw such a fit his daddy tanned his hide with an elm twig. Did he stop his screaming? No, ma'am. He held firm, forcing his whipping to go all the longer. Finally, his daddy couldn't bring him, so he apologized to the sharecropper, and Tabby stayed put. Poor Mr. John Gray couldn't sit at the dinner table for a whole week because his behind was so blistered. After the war ended, she stayed with him. I guess you can say I just tagged along.
Be a dear and fetch some more water, Thornton. What about marriage?
Marriage?
Surely you want to be a daddy someday.
There was a time I did, but the sun doesn't always shine on every tree. Some are forced to live in the shade.
Have you ever been in love?
I suppose.
Did you want to marry her?
I hoped to one day.
What stopped you?
She was white.
What was she like?
Her name was Abigail, but I called her Abby. She was a pretty thing. Golden brown hair with freckles on her nose and the sweetest smile you ever did see.
How did you meet?
Her daddy had come to ask Mr. Gray a favor. He needed a loan to replace his roofing. You see, he was a preacher man. He had just arrived from New England and was fixing to start up a new church on the east side of town.
What kind of minister?
They're all the same, aren't they?
Well, not exactly, but did he have a wife?
She died at the sea when they were getting here. Tossed her overboard off the Florida coast.
When did you first see her?
Mr. Gray asked me to take some oats out to the preacher's horse and buggy. I didn't know she'd be sitting there, though. Her eyes lit up when I neared her. At first, I thought I'd spoke her. But then there was that smile. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I looked funny or something. Then I heard her sweet voice asking my name. When I told her, she repeated it, and I swear, never did I ever hear it said finer in my life.
What then?
I stood there feeding that horse, one oat at a time, so I could talk with her as long as I could.
So that was the beginning?
Yes, Mrs. Tiffany. But to this day, I don't know what faith they were. I showed up at their church every Sunday over the next year. I only knew two things were sure. They talked a lot about Jesus, and Abby had the prettiest smile in the whole congregation.
Did you meet outside the church?
I let her know the days I ran errands in town. The streets were busy with folks, and we'd be a distance from one another, making eyes and smiling. She'd usually sit on a bench in front of the hardware store, knitting on a sweater, taking peeks at me where I was leaning up against a wood pole on the other side of the street.
Weren't you scared her daddy would find out?
He was different than other white folks. He didn't mind my talking to his daughter. Abby said it was their faith that made him colorblind. He told her I was no less a man than any other son of the South.
It's hard to believe he was that tolerant.
Before long, I was helping him put new shingles on his church roof, and I was invited to their lunch table sitting right next to Abby.
Did John know what you were doing?
He was gone most of the time on trips to Georgia and South Carolina. I made my own decisions then.
Did he know about her?
I figured what he don't know ain't gonna hurt much, so I kept it a secret.
Did any others become suspicious?
People noticed our talking and smiling, thinking something was dirty between us. It was spreading round, which got back to her father. He decided to share his feelings in his next Sunday sermon. He talked about the fear people have when up against something they don't understand and how it makes them strike out in anger. He said our country fought a civil war to rid those fears, and that was the very same fear that crucified Jesus.
What was their reaction?
They were real quiet walking out of that church. There was a fire that night. People were running all around carrying buckets of water. I was running there until I was out of my breath. What struck me odd was there were more people watching than helping. I ran into the burning house with black smoke choking me and picked up her limp body, setting her in the dirt a safe way from the caving porch and roofing. I looked down at her black ashen face, thinking, even in dying, she was the most beautiful woman I ever did see.
I'm so sorry.
Her father went back to New England after that day. I had no reason to want another wife. Sometimes people don't get to follow their hearts the way they want.
See who that is, Thornton, and if it's Mrs. Riggins, tell her I'm out for the day, and if it's not, offer whoever it is a tall glass of lemonade.